it just didn't feel good to people in the field, feeling like this data was being used not to kind of help schools improve, but to kind of weaponized against them. Mm-hmm. And so those are kind of the types of things that I think erode trust between the field and state officials.
Hello, Vermont. I'm Andy Julo.
And I'm Joanna Grossman.
And this is There's No Way in Creemee.
Vermont politics, culture, and beyond.
Thanks for joining us.
Hello, and welcome to There's No A in Creemee. How's it going, Andy?
It is going well.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about you?
A lot happening. This has been my first week out as a real candidate in the wild.
Yeah.
And it's been really amazing.
You're like a celebrity now.
It's weird. Yeah. Like everyone is like, well, not everyone, but like a lot of folks have been like coming out of the woodwork, like, oh, like, so you're running, congratulations.
Yep.
You know, it's very sweet. Like people I haven't like talked to or heard from in ages, you know, checking in, and that's been really fun. Yeah, so it's really been already just been an amazing experience, and I feel like incredibly privileged to be able to do it. So
nice.
Yeah. It's been really good. I've also been, so at time of recording yesterday, there was this big ice raid in South Burlington, which is in my district. And that was a lot. It was a lot to process. I got messages like all night about it. And I was talking with a number of legislators who were there this morning who were really shaken. And it's funny, like when you sign up to run for office, I've always had kind of a protective streak in me. I've got this like Jewish mom campaign manager like personality. Yeah, totally. Yeah. And I just kind of felt like, I'm not even elected yet. And I felt like, whoa, you just came after my people. Yeah. You know, and I'm mad about it. Yeah. And it was not okay.
It was very intense. Just, the coverage and just watching it play out on video it was hard to watch, and I can't even imagine what it was like to be there.
It seems to me that I can't imagine anything that would justify that level of force. And, you know, we learned this morning that they didn't even get the guy they were after. Yeah. There were children in that house. Mm-hmm. There were protesters who were tear gassed. I talked to a lawmaker this morning who was tear gassed. I mean, I honestly can't get my head around it. And I'm so angry at what they've done to my community. And at the same time, I'm so proud of how many Vermonters showed up. I think that's so amazing. And that just shows exactly who we are. Mm-hmm.
And it's a difficult thing to pivot from.
Yeah.
But we had a great conversation today about another difficult topic, education reform, and with Alison Novak from 7 Days, who is just... She's got an education background, and now she's an education reporter, and she's just one of the best. In fact, about to be recognized as one of the best.
The New England Newspaper and Press Association is going to be naming her Reporter of the Year. How cool is that?
That is really cool, because we have some great reporters up there covering Vermont.
Yeah.
And it's good that they're getting their dues.
Yeah.
And we talked about some of the bills that we're going over because it is crossover week.
Yes, it is.
As we record this.
Yeah. What's crossover again?
Every year, there's about a midway point in the session where bills that started on the House go over to the Senate, and bills that started on the Senate side go over to the House. Yeah. And that's crossover. And if your bill doesn't make it, then it's dead for the session.
Yeah.
But there are a ton of exceptions. There's the finance bills the finance committees get an extra week before their crossover. And they make these rules so they can suspend the rules at any time. And particularly with education, these bigger issues, they tend to have companion bills on either side. The bills that start out roughly equivalent to each other. And those cross over, but they stay in sync for most of the session.
Right.
And so both committees get the whole session to work on those bills. And that tends to be what happens with bigger things like education.
Yep.
But still, differences definitely forming between the Senate and the House versions of education reform.
Yes.
And we talk about that.
Yeah. We actually, you know what, little adjacent glossary of shame item there. Sometimes we talk about, or we have guests who talk about a bill being stuck on the wall. And I wanted to explain that. So the bills literally are in the committee rooms in the State House, paper copies are like push pinned into a little corkboard on the wall. And so if something doesn't make it, it's stuck on the wall. And you often hear like an advocate say, oh yeah, we have this great bill, but it's stuck on the wall.
Yeah, and it's a biennium. So last year, if it was stuck on the wall at crossover, they could come back to it this year. Mm-hmm. If it's stuck on the wall after February or March 13th this year, it is dead.
Yeah, R.I.P.
Yes.
Yeah. Some big political news this week. Friend of the show, Amanda Janoo, announced that she is running for governor.
Yes, she did.
Yeah.
And if you go to her webpage, our interview with her is featured right there.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have a candidate and, we're excited to see how that unfolds.
Yes, she's laid out a platform and not surprisingly, it tracks very closely to what we talked about with her when she was on the show.
Yep.
So
very impressive.
Pretty exciting.
Yeah. Yeah. We're excited to see how that unfolds. It should be good. I was up in Montpelier earlier this week, and it was very muddy. We're full into mud season. Is it muddy by you?
Yeah.
It is?
Yeah. And we don't have the sidewalks, concrete sidewalks and the asphalt driveways to walk around on. We end up deep in mud.
It's muddy.
In fact, one of our doors froze shut, like the breezeway, the frost affected it. So we're walking out the construction site and we're walking across the yard, which is getting really bad. We've laid a bunch of planks out to walk on.
Oh.
But fortunately, it went back down. The garage sunk a little bit. We can now go out the front door again and we don't have to walk through the mud because it was getting pretty hairy. I love winter. I have no desire to go to Florida or south at any point during the winter. But like March and the first week of April, it has some appeal. Yeah,
that makes sense. Okay, well, we're excited for you to hear this interview with Alison Novak.
Enjoy.
Hello and welcome to There's No A in Creemee, Alison Novak. We're so excited you're here. You're a real live reporter, the real thing from 7 days. And we're excited to have you here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I listen to your podcast a lot, so it's cool to be a guest.
Aww. That's nice to hear. Yes, sometimes folks say to Andy and I, they refer to us as reporters or journalists. And we're like, we're part of the media. I don't know that we're real reporters, but you are. And so it's fun to have you here.
I feel like local media is kind of dying, so having as many people as we can on hand is good. Yeah, so for our democracy.
Yeah, we could do a whole episode on local media. I'm trying to save it, actually. Okay. Well, we would love to hear a little about your background, who you are, and, what your role is in the media.
Sure. So I think one of the things I like to tell people is I didn't know I wanted to be a journalist. Well, I thought I did in college, and then I took a detour and I became a teacher. And so I actually think having the experience, so I lived in New York City, I taught in the South Bronx. I was part of a program called the New York City Teaching Fellows, where they kind of pay for your master's and put you in kind of an underserved school. And so I taught in the South Bronx for 3 years, moved up to Burlington, taught in the Burlington public schools for a couple years. And then when I had kids, kind of wanted to change careers and just on a whim decided to apply as a calendar writer to Kids Vermont, which was 7 Days parenting publication. And just so happened to kind of keep on working my way up, and around the pandemic became 7 Days education reporter. We had never had a kind of designated K-12 education reporter, but I think, it became kind of clear during the pandemic that education was just a huge topic that we needed to have more coverage of. And, I do think my experience as a teacher, someone who's kind of been in schools, has informed the way I report and maybe also helped me kind of just know what questions to ask people who work in schools, because I've kind of been there.
Yeah, that makes sense. You just wrote a really interesting story about the politicization of education policy. And, something we've been hearing a lot from a lot of our guests is about the sort of erosion of public trust in government and how that's sort of impeding our progress and how we can make policy and move things forward. And I wondered if you would share a little about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so I think, if you wanted to pick a point where things kind of changed in education in Vermont. There's probably a lot of kind of turning points, but in 2012, that's when the Department of Education became an agency of education and the Commissioner of Education became a secretary. And prior to that time, the commissioner was chosen by the State Board of Ed. And then after that time, the governor was the person who had the final say and who became Secretary of Education. And, you know, it was interesting talking to superintendents who have been doing this a long time. And, you know, they talked about a time when it felt a lot more collaborative between the Agency of Education or the then Department of Education and the field. That there was a lot of kind of work to try to improve schools through things like, you know, teams coming in from the AOE and really kind of sitting down with school administrators and teachers and saying, what do you need? Providing professional development. There was this whole like portfolio system where, you know, there was a lot of collaboration between districts. And that has really changed. You know, both of them said like that is really no longer the tone. And, you know, I think one of the most telling things that happened recently was the Agency of Education under Secretary Zoe Saunders has made a really big effort to kind of say like data matters and we want to use data to kind of improve schools in Vermont. But I think there's a question about how that data is being used and even how accurate some of the data is. And so I had superintendents, you know, tell me, and I've heard this over the years, that like they feel like some of the data that the Agency of Education is presenting them with about their schools and kind of saying like, here's this data we collected, can you look at it, can you validate it, is not accurate or doesn't match the data that school districts have in-house. And so I think that has kind of eroded some trust. Yeah. And then the state report card, which was released a couple of weeks ago, I mean, I note this in my article, but after the Agency of Education released the state report card, like literally 4 minutes later, the governor put out a statement saying the results of this report card are why we need to do education reform. And just that kind of timing, I think, felt very kind of suspect or very kind of, it just didn't feel good to people in the field, feeling like this data was being used not to kind of help schools improve, but to kind of weaponized against them. And so those are kind of the types of things that I think erode trust between the field and state officials.
That like feels like an alternate facts situation. Like that's not, I can see how that would feel really hard for school administrators.
Yeah. One of the superintendents I talked to, Mike Leckleiter, who is the superintendent at Harwood, you know, he has studied data. He wrote his doctoral dissertation on standardized tests, and he was kind of explaining to me the way that kind of growth is measured in Vermont. It's an imprecise measure. So they're using proficiency scores versus like numerical scores to show growth. So in simple terms, that would be like if a student went from an 80 to 89, they wouldn't be counted as showing growth because they didn't go up a level. And he was just saying, you know, we want to be held accountable. We want to improve. I think there's no question that, you know, we have seen our test scores, our standardized test scores go down in Vermont. So I think there's an acknowledgement by the field that like we have some issues, we have some problems, but like if you're going to hold schools accountable, support them, give them the tools they need to succeed versus just kind of saying you're not doing well.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah, I started on a school board in, I think, 08 or 09, and that was one of the first years that the tax commissioner's recommendation for a base rate wasn't just taken at face value. It became a political process, and we've seen that get further and further apart.
Yeah.
And now voters are going to the polls on town meeting day without a real picture for what their tax rate will be, and that's certainly not helped build trust as well.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think there is a real disconnection between school budgets and property taxes right now. I was talking to a principal from the eastern part of the state, Oxbow High School, and he was explaining to me they don't vote on their school budget until the end of April.
Oh, wow.
And he was saying that they were like making some pretty big cuts to programs and still expecting a 30% increase in property taxes because of factors including the CLA or common level of appraisal, as well as a loss of pupils. And again, there was some data confusion there about why they were losing so many weighted pupils. And so like he was making the point that like, voters don't get that. They don't understand. Like if you see a 30% increase in property taxes, you kind of assume schools are spending exorbitantly, and that's not the case. So in terms of fixing our, education funding system, I do think there has to be, seems like people are in agreement that there have to be some changes to kind of make that a little more straightforward for voters.
Yeah, try telling a gym full of voters that your budget's going down, but your tax rate is going up, and then explaining that in a way that's going to build any credibility for everybody.
Right.
Yeah, it's difficult.
And, I think another interesting thing we saw from town meeting day was that some of the budgets that got defeated were in the lowest spending districts. Yeah. And I think that also raises the question about, like, if we're trying to provide equitable education, like, we're clearly not doing that in our current system. And I think Secretary Saunders and perhaps the governor would argue that bigger districts are a way to kind of provide that more equitable education. But I think there's questions about like if that is actually correct.
Yeah. I mean,
Yep. So let's dive. We're about the midway point in the session. We covered a lot of the task force. In the summer, there was a lot going on in the summer, and then the session started, and it's been a little chaotic, and it's now starting to round into form a little bit.
Yeah.
Let's talk about these maps, these cursed maps that somebody has to draw. Where are we at with drawing district boundaries in the Senate and House and the governor's office?
Can I just frame it up for
Yeah.
some of our newer listeners?
Yeah.
So the Education Redistricting Task Force that met, it came out of Act 73, you know this, but came out of Act 73 and met over the summer and the fall, and their charge was to draw these maps that would redistrict Vermont, and they didn't do it. And so now it's on the legislature and take it from there.
Yeah, and I mean, I think what's important to note is they didn't do it, but they did have other recommendations for how to kind of achieve cost savings. Right. Primarily, I think the recommendation of forming these BOCES or education service areas or agencies that would essentially not lead to governance changes, but would require school districts to kind of work together to provide things like special education and do hiring and do IT stuff. And so kind of share their services in a way to kind of save money. So, and I think they did look at drawing maps, and I think what they realized is just like they didn't see how that was going to achieve the cost savings that, we desire.
Right. Oh, they said explicitly that moving the lines around wasn't going to save money.
Right,
yeah.
right. And so then, as we know, the governor said that they failed at their job. And so now we're at, the legislature has to kind of pick up from where they left off. And so I think there's been an attempt to kind of put out some different maps. So the House Education Committee, that's chaired by Peter Conlin, who is from Cornwall, who has been chair of that committee for quite a while. And so he proposed a map that I think has 27 school districts. So it consolidates, but not to the level that the Scott administration has wanted. But I think, even within his committee, there's been a lot of questions about I don't think the committee is definitely not in consensus about that map. And they're still kind of looking at that map and trying to do some cost modeling to figure out what that would actually mean for school districts. In Conlin's construct, it would be districts that were between around 2,000 to 4,000 students, which I think is kind of research shows is kind of the optimal number of students to achieve cost savings without, getting too big. But, there's a number of people on that committee that represent, independent school interests or also come from really rural areas that feel like, that would mean a loss of local voice and local control. And so I think they're still kind of wading through that process. And I was listening yesterday, and it kind of seems like that Representative Conlin kind of is acknowledging that they might not be able to achieve consensus and maybe want to focus on some of the more low-hanging fruit, such as forming these educational service areas / BOCES or restarting school construction aid, which is something I think that we really need to do as a state. And then on the other side, the Senate Education Committee is kind of like doing something completely different. So their chair, Senator Seth Bongartz, who, does have ties to Burton, an independent school in Manchester, he has suggested a map that preserves school choice in all the areas that have it currently, and then calls for voluntary mergers among some of the school districts in the Chittenden County area that don't have choice, and voluntary mergers and giving them 2 years to do that. So again, it's not really hammered out. There's a lot of details that are unclear, I think. And I think it's like when the legislators start talking about these nitty-gritty details, like it becomes clear how complicated this all is.
Yeah, and there's some question about when we talk about school choice, how wide that is. It sounds like the Senate is more in favor of a complete wide open, whereas the House will preserve choice to the 4 historic academies, but not outside of those.
Right. So in the House proposal, they're saying that there would be no more supervisory unions, that it would just be school districts, and that there would still be the ability to send kids to those academies, but they would have to be designated. It wouldn't be the choice of the family, but it would be like the school district would have to have a contract with those schools. So it could eliminate some of the schools that are currently eligible for public dollars, such as the ski academies, perhaps, which are still the ski academies like Killington Mountain School, Burke Mountain School, those schools are still eligible for public dollars. And I think that Conlon's plan might eliminate that, although he hasn't said that specifically, but that's kind of how I see it. Yeah.
Yeah, the independent schools piece is, clearly there was some progress made in 73, at least like the way I see it. But I think that was a really interesting facet of it. 73 did a lot of things. And, no matter what side of it you're on, it seems like some people liked some of it and some people didn't like some of it. And it's sort of hard to tease out. I saw that a couple parents, or maybe one family, I don't know if it was 2, from Rice are actually suing the state now because their next kids will not be able to get school choice into that program.
There's also a similar lawsuit. So you probably remember Mid-Vermont Christian School and the lawsuit they filed against the Agency of Education around kind of the policies around trans students in sports.
Yes.
And they've expanded their lawsuit to also challenge Act 73's choice provisions. So there's a couple of legal things in the in the works around that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that when people have choice, they don't want to give it up.
Sure.
Right? And so that is something that is going to have to be reconciled. And it feels like it is like a third rail. And it's just something that people, I think in Vermont, we want to kind of like, people want things the way they have always been, you know, but they also don't want to pay a lot of money for it.
Right.
And that's kind of a hard needle to thread because it's very expensive to kind of have all these small schools and to have choice in many towns. And yeah, so I think something's got to give, but it just feels like, Peter Conlon has said over and over again, like we have to have the political will to do this. And I don't know, it feels like maybe that political will is not there.
Yeah. We had Krista Huling on a few months back to talk about the Same Dollar, Same Rules campaign. And I thought that was really interesting. I feel like Vermont has a way of sort of, this is going to come out bad, but which maybe isn't great given I'm running for office, but I feel like Vermont has a way of sort of fetishizing our intransigence. Like we have like, oh yeah, everything, it's so cute that Vermont is exactly how it was 100 years ago, but it's not cute if you're the person who it wasn't cute for. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's like, it seems to be their argument is like, yes, like we understand that, these private schools were really great for some families, but if they're not being held to the same standards and the same rules as everybody else, then should we really be giving them public money?
Yeah. I think there's this idea that like traditionally this has worked and we want to continue to do it this way because it's worked for people in the past. And is it still working in the way we want it to work? I mean, I think that also comes up with small schools and the closure of small schools. And I mean, I feel like I've talked to plenty of people over my years of reporting, you know, who live in small communities in small towns. And I totally get why they don't want to see the closure of their small schools. Like, it is devastating, you know, when you have a school in the middle of your town and it closes, like that changes your whole way of life.
Yeah.
But I also think there is, you know, I wrote last month about declining enrollment in Vermont schools, and like something's got to give, right? We are seeing declining enrollment, a pretty steep decline in enrollment, pretty much everywhere except a couple communities, and it looks like it's projected to continue. So how are we going to adapt to that? And if we're not, then we better be ready to pay for it. So, yeah.
I'm always fascinated about the enrollment conversation because we've got like the chamber saying, oh, we need more Vermonters. We do. We actually do need more Vermonters to come here to fill out the workforce. And then at the same time, we're closing small schools. And I'm like, wait, the two things don't go together.
Right. And is it a self-fulfilling prophecy or whatever, if we close schools, that people will leave? Although, you know, when I wrote that story on declining enrollment, one superintendent, Patrick Green of Mount Abraham, said to me, you know, well, we've had all these little schools for many, many years, and we're still losing families and losing kids. So I don't know if it holds that they're keeping families in Vermont because we are seeing declining enrollment. So, you know, I think there's an argument on both sides, maybe. Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. And I think the idea of more regional high schools is a more palatable idea to a lot of people because, you know, those older students are more able to travel, and it's not, you know, I think closing small elementary schools, which is what's been happening as in our current system, I think maybe is more damaging than actually like trying to consolidate small high schools because, you know, I think those small high schools like don't provide the same opportunities as larger high schools in Vermont. I mean, I think there's probably really good things about small high schools, but in terms of kind of the offerings, it's going to be a lot less than in bigger schools. So.
Yeah.
So while we're having these discussions about boundaries and district sizes, we're also having a conversation about technical education, and there's been a lot of frustration there that it's not as cleanly integrated and not as well funded as you know, high schools. And what's going on with technical education to try to make that stronger right now?
Well, I mean, I know that the Agency of Education has put forward a plan to kind of create a more unified technical education system. I think right now we have like all these different tech ed programs, and they're kind of offering different things, and some have wait lists and some don't. And I think it seems like this kind of speaks to how things are in Vermont in terms of the kind of disparate, like everyone is kind of doing their own thing.
Right.
And I think there's this effort to create a more unified system. But I think often there's pushback because of people's desire to have local control. I think this gets into the testing thing too. It's like our test scores, our standardized test scores have gone down. And I think what some argue is if we had a more kind of unified system with a curriculum, everyone's kind of doing a similar thing, and there's graduation requirements that are statewide graduation requirements, we'd see better results. But everyone right now is kind of operating in their own little fiefdoms or bubbles. And I think that's kind of the case with career and technical education as well.
Yeah, the question of equity versus equality is coming up
right.
Yeah.
And I think in terms of like looking at the foundation formula and how that would fund tech ed, that's very unclear right now. And so that's a question mark that's out there that makes it hard to do like modeling around what a foundation formula's impact would actually be in schools and tech programs.
That's a really interesting point because that could really have a whole other like equity implication if those students aren't getting resources.
Yeah. And I mean, Zoe Saunders has said, I mean, from the beginning that she wants to put more kind of tech ed into kind of like not make it separate from schools, but like introduce it in middle schools and incorporate it into high schools versus having these like two different systems, like the tech ed system kind of apart from the, you know, typical high school system. So I still think, though, with so many questions around how these reform efforts are going to go, it feels like before that is figured out, it's going to be a little hard to kind of make a very comprehensive plan around career and tech ed. And that's part of what I wonder when I go through, every Sunday I look through the schedules for all the committees that are relevant to my beat. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I think, why aren't they spending every single minute of their time on Act 73? Mm-hmm. Because they got to figure this out. Why are they, why are they even considering these smaller bills? I know, I'm probably missing something about how the legislature works, but part of me is this is the time when the rubber hits the road and they should be full on just trying to nail down a plan if this is what they want to do, rather than kind of going to this bill and this bill. And there's a lot of jumping around, and part of me wonders why there's not a more concerted effort to really kind of get Act 73 nailed down.
Is that maybe the election looming over their heads in November?
Maybe, yeah. I think, I don't know, from what I can see, I think there's been a little more focus on Act 73 in House education than in Senate education. When I look at the schedules and watch the testimony, I do feel they're maybe a little more laser focused on trying to figure out what they can do with Act 73. And I don't know, I think the Senate seems like they're kind of doing a bunch of different things. So
I almost think, I don't think there is election related urgency. I could be wrong, but I feel when you ran, we just, that issue had not been taken seriously in the previous session. It made it really hard for us to run. And I do worry now, with Democrats and at-risk seats, really anyone of any party right now, who is in an at-risk seat, I'm not sure what they're going to be able to take to doors because they haven't gotten on top of it.
Right.
And it's hard to know what to make. Most of the budget's passed this cycle.
Right. So is some of the urgency gone?
Yeah.
And if it's gone, does that mean we're just going to not move forward with Act 73 in the way it was intended? There's this problem where often, laws are changed, reform is kind of made in the legislature, and then there's not a real follow through on these things, and then we're back to square one. Act 173, which is kind of technical, but this is this multi-tiered systems of support. So essentially trying to provide every student with really high quality instruction in their classroom so that they're maybe less likely to kind of fall through the cracks and even need to be put in given special supports, special education. I feel that was everyone says that was a really good law, but it just wasn't implemented well. And, then we're on to the next thing.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, a big problem, that we don't kind of follow through on some of the initiatives that are actually good legislation, but then just kind of we move on to something different without kind of assessing how well they've worked or if we've implemented them with fidelity. So, yeah.
I do feel we keep hearing this theme bubbling up about accountability, government accountability. That it's just you're saying, a lot of laws passed with great intention and then they aren't followed up on for whatever reason.
See our interview with Tim Ash.
Absolutely. Taxes and revenue, funding the system. I know there was a slice of 73 that was intended for a second homeowners tax. One of the great things that in my mind came out of 73 was that the Department of Tax had to put together this report that put together these different models of how we could backfill the education fund through a second homeowners tax. And I think that's a really great resource that isn't really out there enough. I'm curious your read on that approach.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think when people think of Act 73, I think they think of maps, and I think they think of, new funding formula, but there's a lot of things in Act 73, like you said. And so, that kind of rethinking the property tax classifications, I think seems like a pretty popular idea among, the public. And I know, for example, in Stowe, I was talking to the superintendent there a couple of weeks ago, and he was explaining to me that for the first time in a long time, the property tax rates were higher than the homestead property tax rates were higher than the non-homestead property tax rates. And like how that's kind of a perverse system, right? When you have Airbnbs like taxed at a lower rate than homes.
Yeah.
I do think this idea of like reconsidering the property tax categories seems to be one that's pretty popular with Vermonters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How did your Stowe guy take it?
Well, I think, he made an interesting point, which is, I think he's in favor of it. I don't want to speak for him, but I think he did talk about the fact that some people who are living in Stowe, who, are sending kids to the schools, they actually, they make their money through, Airbnbs and rental properties and not wanting to kind of harm them.
Right.
So that was interesting to me, just that there's like, it's not as simple as just taxing those properties at a higher rate, that there's actually like Vermonters that are relying on those properties to make their living.
Yeah.
So
that makes sense.
Yeah.
When I was a national organizer for Indivisible, so it was a national team, and we all worked from home from all over the country. And it was during the pandemic, and I can't tell you how many people from all over, but especially the New York area, had second homes in like Killington and Stowe, and were going to their second homes like during the pandemic. And they're like, "Oh, is that near you?" And I was like astonished at how many people had a second place here.
Yeah.
So I think, kind of at the core here, we're having a debate that we've had many times before, is who is most effective and efficient at administering education, our local communities or the state of Vermont? And it's been local communities have won out over and over and over again when we've discussed this in the past. Do you feel that balance shifting with the recent rises in property taxes, that there might be more faith in the state to handle this, or is that trust issue also downplaying that faith?
I think that trust issue is kind of getting in the way of things. I do think that when I talk to superintendents, they say we would like more guidance. We would like more guidance from the state in terms of kind of what we should be doing, curriculum, kind of graduation requirements, that kind of thing. But like, they don't want to feel like, they want to feel like it's a collaborative process, and they want to feel like they're being included in the kind of, their feedback is being incorporated into whatever is decided at the state level. And like several school leaders mentioned to me, there was this big retreat that the AOE threw in Killington, or had in Killington, that was kind of a strategic planning retreat back in November. And administrators were invited, and kind of it was billed as a way for them to share their input on different things, including graduation requirements, special education. And a couple of school leaders said to me they felt like, they were excited about it because they were like, this is our chance to kind of give input. And then when they saw the product that came out of that, in one case, it was this AOE did a graduation requirements report. They were disappointed that they felt like none of their input was incorporated. And so I guess it's like, what does authentic engagement from the field actually look like? And what does collaboration actually look like? Because I don't feel that superintendents feel like there's collaboration right now. And I think what Secretary Saunders might say, because as part of my story, I kind of asked her to respond to some of the things the superintendents had said, is that there is this inherent tension between like school districts being able to they've been able to do their own thing for a long time. And when someone comes in then and says like, this is how things should be done, there's a lot of pushback to that. So there needs to be some type of balance where there maybe is a little more kind of from above guidance, but it feels collaborative versus like a top down, like do it this way.
Sure.
So I don't know if that answers the question, but
I don't think there is an answer to that question.
Yeah.
It's just this balance of these two forces that we've never quite found a perfect solution to.
And I do think, I don't know, having been a teacher and my husband's a middle school teacher, like I do feel like there is a role for the state to play in terms of like, I think it's actually helpful to teachers when they have a little more structure and guidance around what they should be teaching, how it should be taught, coordination, so that if a child moves from Burlington to South Burlington, they're not doing something completely different,
right.
So And also when when you think about equity, it's like, you shouldn't have in one high school much more rigorous graduation requirements than in another high school. Everyone should be getting a rigorous education. So I do think there is a role to play to like make things a little more cohesive, but it doesn't feel like the agency has kind of found a way yet to navigate that in a way that feels like comfortable or helpful to the field. So
It seems like we do a lot less of that here. There's really a lot more set curricula in New York State, and here there's very little. And now all of a sudden the state's like kind of coming in, and
and you could see why when people have been able to do things their own way for a long time, they would bristle at being told what to do.
Yeah.
But I think it's also like the way they're being told, and maybe what they're being told. So. There's definitely tension there. And I agree because I am from New York and I taught in New York. And so when I was a teacher in New York and then came and became a teacher in Vermont, I was like shocked at how, for lack of a better word, like loosey-goosey it was.
It is, yeah.
Which is like great in some ways, right? And it kind of, I think, encourages creativity. And but I also think it's sometimes when you have very little direction, it's hard,
There's like so many different ways that the state can be involved, right? Like in New York, there was a lot of curriculum. There was a lot of like resources and worksheets, like whatever. There was, just like so much content that teachers could draw from that I'm not seeing here in the schools. But like here, like it seems like the grab is at like an administrative level of control instead of like actual like resources for the classroom.
Right. And
I'm like, I'm not sure we're going about this quite the right way.
Right. I mean, I don't want to downplay the fact that like school districts have like different levels, but school districts have like coordinated curriculum that they've developed. And so it's like school districts are making these decisions and like trying to create a cohesive system, but like they're kind of on their own to do it.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I'm not downplaying the fact that school districts themselves are like, just telling teachers do whatever you want.
No.
But
my
it's
kids'
like
teachers are amazing.
Yeah. But and I always like, I feel like having been a teacher, it's like that is where I come from, the place of like knowing how hard the work is. And so part of me sometimes when I see legislators like trying to kind of like make all these decisions about what's going to happen in schools, I'm like, you think that works hard? Like try like hanging out with, 25, 13-year-olds or 11-year-olds like my husband does every day. It's like that is hard work. And teachers and administrators, they're doing hard work. So
They really are. I feel so grateful to all of our teachers. Okay.
We're just about out of time.
Oh, wow.
Want to try to squeeze in one more question, or?
What, should we skip to our last question?
Sure.
Wow. Okay, I think you get to ask it.
I get to ask this one. So we have a tradition here on There's No Way in Creemee. We like to ask our guests, when you go to a Creemee stand, what are you ordering?
Well, I'm going to give you an answer that maybe you've heard before, but so this is not a Creemee stand. It's Yates Family Orchard. Have you heard this answer? So the Dreamee?
No.
Whoa.
No.
So in Moncton, Yates Family Orchard has something called the Dreamee, which is a cider donut with Creemee on top of it. And you can even get it with like apple pie filling, whipped cream, caramel sauce, which it's called something different, like the Supremey Dreamee when you get it with that.
Are there A's in it?
Good question. I don't know, but their cider donuts are amazing. And just like to top it with Creemee, they have vanilla, maple, maybe chocolate, but I don't get chocolate. I'll either get vanilla or maple.
Nice.
And it's really good.
That is amazing.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
I honestly do not think we've had a duplicate answer yet.
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, there are a lot of ways to do a Creemee.
Wait, and did you say sprinkles or no sprinkles?
I don't think they offer sprinkles
all
there.
right.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And
So
I probably wouldn't get them even if they did because
it does sound like a lot, like to start with. Yeah. Whoa, that's a really interesting. That's a little bit like what I tried to do at my Hanukkah party. Like we had donuts, and then I borrowed a Creemee maker from a friend, and we put Creamies on top of the donuts because like donuts are Hanukkah foods. So,
right.
Yeah,
you have to eat it quick so that the donut stays crisp. Yeah.
Yes, and also so the Creemee doesn't go through the whole of the donut.
Right.
Yeah, there's a lot of moving parts there. Yeah. Good answer. Whoa. Thank you so much for coming on the show with us.
You're welcome. It was fun.
Thank you.
I enjoyed it.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode.
Thank you all for listening.
Follow us between episodes for the latest updates on our socials at There's No A in Creemee on Instagram, Substack, and Blue Sky.
And catch us on our next episode of There's No A in Creemee, Vermont Politics, Culture, and Beyond in Apple Podcasts and Spotify.